right, good afternoon. If I can have your attention, please. We are now being joined by our friends online. Good afternoon. My name's Emma Dawson. For those of you who don't know me, I think I know most of you. And we meet today on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and thank them for their custodianship of the lands on which we meet over many generations, lands which were never ceded. Welcome to the June, isn't it, luncheon, John Cain luncheon here at Graduate House at the University of Melbourne. It's lovely to see you all. One of the bigger crowds we've had for a while, although we lost a few people to the latest COVID wave, so stay safe, all of you. We are being super cautious at Capita. I'm absolutely delighted today to introduce to you, for those of you who don't know him, Mark Considine, who has written a book that I was very proud to endorse and called Essential to Understanding Where We've Gone Wrong and What We Can Do to Restore the Integrity and Utility of Social Services in Australia, is the quote from me on the back of the book. I think I also said I thought it was the most timely publication on social policy I've read for some time. We do have some copies available for sale. Not many, because I keep giving them away to people and going, you have to read this. It is really excellent. Yes. Hi. Yes. Yes.
How much is it, so I can leave money?
Meredith, how much is it? $35. And we can arrange copies for other people if we run out here too. This is an excellent look at what we have done with essential services in Australia through outsourcing, privatising, and creating now a system that is largely in the hands of the market, whether that be for profit or non-profit. I shan't say too much because Mark's here to talk about his own fantastic work, so please make Mark very welcome.
Thank you, Emma, and thanks again for the endorsement. It's always a slightly embarrassing moment when the publisher says, we'd like to go and ask some people to write an endorsement on your book. And you can make suggestions about who those people might be if you like, but we have a list. And I said, look, I'm happy to go with your list. Then you sit back and wait, because it's up to the book publisher exactly what they put on the cover and what the quote says, and it's not until you get your advanced copy of the book and you say, oh my goodness, such eminent people, and they've said, surprisingly nice things. So it really has it's helped the book. And as many of you in the room would know, having been associated with research and policy development and probably with book production, there's a certain moment with anything you've worked on where it stops being you and becomes something else. And with a book, that's when it goes into people's hands and they start responding to it, agreeing with it, disagreeing with it, asking for a different story. It's the book then becomes a kind of a thing that you were part of at one stage, but is then part of something else, part of hopefully a dialogue, a debate, argument, sometimes furious argument. And we're in that stage now. The book's been out since October. Not everybody loves it. A lot of people have responded, many more responses to this book than any of the other more academic publications, I guess, that I've been involved in. It has hit a nerve in many parts of the policy community, but also in the broader community. This is the first time I've written a book where unsolicited emails and phone calls and handwritten letters from people have come in to sort of say, like, I read this bit and I wanted to tell you X, Y, and Z. So I hope in the context of today there's plenty of opportunity for that kind of feedback. I think I'm quite good at taking criticism or suggestions for improvement, but I'm also interested in the ideas progressing and how we get what's involved in this story developed into a way and a shape that it can make a difference to what are an alarming number of common problems in the Australian social service story. And that's the major theme of the book. I'm not going to rehearse the whole book. I thought I'd spend the time available drawing out some of the bigger themes of the book and some examples, and then leaving it to the conversation afterwards and to your reading if you get to the book itself. The starting point really was the recognition that we had this welter of Royal Commissions and inquiries, Productivity Commission reviews, parliamentary inquiries in the broader social service sector over the last 7 or 8 years, all of them drawing attention to fundamental, disturbing and unresolved problems. Not exactly the same problem in every case. This is not a sort of one problem fits all story. These are complicated policy areas, as many of you in the room would know, having worked in these sectors. But I thought there were a number of themes that were worth testing. Some family resemblances, I call them, in a number of the reviews and diagnostics, and in some of the work we'd been doing over a long period of time in the employment service sector. One of the key common issues, if not common problems, was the recognition that the system for delivering social support in Australia had become much more dependent on a service market framework than had once been the case. Service markets are not real markets in the way that economists or consumers would understand them. They're a method of delivering services through multiple agencies who compete at some level, usually for government attention first of all, and then perhaps for clients or customers. The long journey of producing a social service system that was delivered primarily by social markets and not simply by governments with the support of other agencies is a journey that really had started in the US in the 70s and 80s with a very deep fundamental critique of the role of government in welfare more broadly. And that critique used the harsh language of welfare dependence to shame anyone receiving social assistance and to largely diminish most of those involved in providing it, including in particular government itself. And that so-called war over welfare was won by a new coalition of popular ideas that included the notion that government would get a better deal for its citizens if it had more choice about who was delivering those services. And that if clients would do better, if they had more choice about who they went to for help when they needed assistance. This was the seductive and, in my view, ultimately failed idea that choice and control belong together in a service, and that if you maximise the amount of choice that's available, you will solve a whole series of other issues, first of all for the government, but secondly, and perhaps most importantly, for the service user. We weren't alone in embracing the great ideas of the so-called choice revolution. That's a term the Swedes now use for their experience of this. I'm not sure it was a revolution, certainly it was a very big deal. And the idea inherent in the choice revolution is the notion that when things don't work out for you, you can exit. And the exit option, at the base of all of the model building for the government side of this and for the client side, is the most powerful engine to drive better behaviour by providers and empowerment for clients to shift to another option. We'll come back to exit and the failure of the exit idea as a driver for service quality. But at the time it was, in the late 80s and 90s, at the time it was being championed including by the so-called third way Labor governments of that era, it was, I have to say, a very attractive, one might say entrancing idea. And it came to underpin a whole series of reforms to the way in which different services were delivered. It had significant consequences, first of all, for the way government itself thought of its role and structured its role. Very often it meant governments chose to step back from frontline services and to take the view that their best job was to buy rather than make. And with public sentiment in mind and the growing dissatisfaction with privatisations in other parts of the economy, it was typical, certainly in Australia, to stop talking about this as privatisation and talk about it as procurement. So governments decided they'd be better to steer the ship of state and have non-government mercenaries do the rowing. Not surprisingly, a very large industry of private agencies quickly jumped aboard. Now, the book, as you'll see if you get to the end of it, or if you skip to the end, does not argue against private provision of these services. I'm not an advocate for turning them back to a government delivery, and you'll see why as I progress these few remarks. But it is true that the particular model that was embraced in almost every case did put private agencies in a position to dominate the service model. Now, the enabling tools to make this new economy of service markets operate was pretty similar across the board. Some variations between aged care, for example, and childcare. Some differences in those services like unemployment services where there's compulsion on the client to participate. So they're not the same, but the broader toolbox was certainly common. A lot of emphasis on pricing of the service or the service components and trying to get that pricing exactly right so that it had some margin for profit, but not too much, but not too little either, or you wouldn't get a group of willing providers. A huge investment in contract writing, an overwhelming, in some ways, deluge of service requirements on departments to create, write and manage contracts, and a huge investment in what I describe as top-down regulation. In the employment services story, as May and others in the room would know, we reached a sort of zenith at one stage where the number of pages of regulation, if you included the contract, just tipped 2,000. And in any one of those 2,000 pages were tripwires nasty enough to send you out of business. So there wasn't anything there that you could afford to say, don't read chapters 5 to 7, that's just, filler. All the way through those regulatory requirements were potential fines, loss of licence, loss of credibility. What had happened as a footnote, what had happened to employment services and what began to happen pretty quickly in aged care reminded me of a story we used to use in class, which was a famous case study of the Forest Service in the US, where in the 50s and 60s the service bureaucratised as a result of trying to set national standards across all the different forests in every different state in the US. And their method for doing that was to create a kind of rule book for what should happen in a forest that was under the control of the service. And it too ran eventually to many thousands of pages. And when the academics got to work studying it, what they discovered was that every time there was an incident, there'd be a new rule. So the high point or the low point of this was reached when somebody in Congress pointed out that we now had rules for the way parents stand while pushing a swing in a playground if it's in a national park. And thankfully they went to work in chopping down the rules. So we had this process where the regulatory regime continued to expand its reach to try and fill gaps or deal with misbehaviour or perceived misbehaviour, and so got bigger and bigger. And guess what? It's not surprising that when that's the regime, you may catch the bad, but what you certainly do is raise the costs for all the good. Now, some services continued during this period to run without social markets. And there's a chapter in the book on maternal and child health and another one on aspects of occupational health and safety that show that there are different models, that not everything went the same way. I haven't got time really to talk much about those today, except to say in those alternative services are indications of why it is that a public service mandated service model is the linchpin to understanding how you manage multiple service delivery. One of the interesting and also worrying aspects of this general shift towards social markets has been the political consequence. At the time, Labor governments believed that bringing private providers into areas like employment services would help make the model robust against future governments undoing their reforms. Here's then Prime Minister Paul Keating quoted at the launch of the employment service reforms in the late 1980s. He began by favourably comparing the market that was about to be created with the, quote, public monolith, unquote, that preceded it. And that's the CES. And in Keating-esque fashion, he quickly revealed the overt political motive from Labor's new affection for the private service provision. And here I quote, "One of the things you've always got to do when you think about social reform in Australia is make it Tory-proof. You've always got to Tory-proof them. You've got to hermetically seal them so they can't get their nasty little right-wing fingernails under them and tear them away." Well, they didn't need to get their nasty little right-wing fingernails under them because very soon they owned them. The political consequence of the creation of social markets was to produce a much more significant political lobby in favour of expanding the private provision, defending the private owners, resisting attempts on public interest or other grounds to modify their behaviour. You might expect that might have been the case on the Liberal coalition side, who are a pro-business lobby, and certainly it was. You may well be aware that the privatisation of childcare was championed strongly from that side of the Parliament, and a number of senior Liberals also backed their interest in private markets by investing in them. But so too on the Labor side. Famously, the Rudd family were a very significant owner. Therese was the owner, but arguably that is an asset that was considered by many to be emblematic of the fact that either side or both sides of politics could have very strong material interests in these services. A second important characteristic of the general change that I try to challenge in the book is that a key point of departure for those who advocated social markets was the idea that a publicly provided service would be inherently inflexible. One size fits all was the usual complaint, and even senior bureaucrats were heard to say this. The public service was parodied as a place where, quote, people think they know what's best for you, unquote. And in contrast, service markets were championed as a form of empowerment which respected diversity and the multiplicity of individual needs. You could choose your own adventure. So if you needed childcare, you could go and look at the market, you could compare the different providers, you could even go and have a look if you wanted to, you could see what they were charging, and then you could make a choice about where you wanted to go, and so on through the list of services that were drawn across to this social market model. And as I said before, if things went badly for you, the killer part of the story was that you could vote with your feet, and that the exit power of consumers would both drive innovation by the providers who wanted to keep their customers and protect consumers themselves from bad behaviour. Now, all of this is wrapping around a central problem in these services, which the book talks about, which is that as part of the creation of the service market, Australia, more than any other country that's used a service market method, also decided that they needed to give the entrepreneur a lot of internal freedom to create the service model that would suit their business. The argument from economists is that if you want the innovative sort of potential of the private entrepreneur, you have to keep him or her freed up from too much regulatory constraint on the way they design their business. And then what will happen is you'll get this flowering of different possibilities, like a kind of natural experiment where the best will succeed and the worst will go broke or lose their contract. Same thing. Now, in the book and elsewhere in work we've done, we describe this the way economists describe it, which is as a black box model of service delivery. The criteria in the contract is framed around what the government is purchasing, what the list of purchased services will be, and evaluated by a list of what the outcomes and impacts are that those services are required to produce. And then the methodology in the middle, inside the box, is the entrepreneurial space that's meant to drive service improvement. We used to hear this a lot, and May would remember this in the early days of employment services. The private providers would stand up and say that this is our 11 different herbs and spices, secret herbs and spices, emphasis on secret. Well, it's not Kentucky Fried Chicken, and the secrecy of the black box model, the lack of transparency about what the service delivery mandate is, has been an endemic problem right through the Australian story. And one of the key arguments of the book is that the road to reform has to sit not on simply trying to boot out all of the fraudulent providers. On its own, all that will do will raise the level of regulation and the cost for everybody. The road to reform needs to focus first of all on what that service delivery model looks like. What are we purchasing? What are we buying into? And instead of a black box view of service development and rollout, in all of these cases in the book, we need greater transparency around what we're building. Now, that won't suit some providers who are making money off fraudulent or shady ways of delivering the service. They'll decide that isn't great. But in other services in other countries where transparent shared models of service are used in the contracting story, service providers get a better deal. For example, they're not at such great risk of a sudden change in the contract conditions that sees them out of business in this part of the country and offering contracts somewhere else. There's a no surprises element to those participants who are successful in meeting the objectives of the service delivery model and who are transparently good at what they do. Now, why hasn't that happened already? There are a number of reasons for this, and it does depend a bit on which service you're talking about. But one of the great innovations of the service market model in Australia, if we can call it that, is that the roughly 20% profitability gain for private providers has largely been achieved from reducing staffing costs, reducing the degree of professionalisation in most of the services, and or in some cute but often problematic real estate deals. In the services that require real estate, and I'd include vet in this, there are now some extraordinarily shady arrangements that are sometimes described as ghost colleges, which is probably a good name for them. And as we know, in both childcare and aged care, and certainly in employment services, the big pressure in the early years of the social market model was to reduce the cost of frontline staff, and the more that's driven down, the better the margin. So the innovation potential of these models, where you operate a black box service delivery regime, inevitably points into those forms of innovation. Business systems, the entrepreneurs would call them, but they're business systems which are not directly linked to improvement in the service itself for clients. And secondly, they don't put transparency of the client's interests into that model. So we don't know a lot of the time what's happening to clients until something dreadful happens. There's no transparency in many of these services for communities of interest to be involved. I was talking to somebody recently in the Australian aged care story, and as we know from the Royal Commission, it is and has been a horror story for 20 years. One of the things the Dutch did to address similar issues, they were big on privatisation back in the day, was to legislate to require any care institution receiving government money has to have a client board that's directly involved. The CEO briefs them on a monthly basis. They see the draft plans and budgets, and in the case of the aged services, they get involved in choosing the food. Now, the effect of that on its own is probably marginal, but the effect of it in combination with other transparency measures changes the story from a so-called market model where fraud and misadventure become a very regular part of the diet, and in a system where others are defrauding, it's very hard for honest providers to maintain their part of the sector. So it does become a contagious issue. Bidding up the needs of your clients, saying that they're more needy than they really are in order to get them into a new category. If everybody else is playing that game and you don't play it, guess who's going to be running your service after the next contract round? So getting that level of change into the way we operate, in my view, starts with requiring transparent service models, empowering the people who deliver the service to help create those models. This isn't something that should be done in a dark room by people like me, for example, but needs to be done on the basis that this is the agreed standard of what a great service should look like and how we're going to go about delivering it. And then greater incentives for those services to innovate against that model, to show how they could do it better. Not by simply dragging costs out and saying that was an improvement, but making things better for the clients. It's done elsewhere, it could be done here. It needs government to pay attention. Many other things are covered in the book, horror stories in some cases, but a discussion of other ways in which reforms and improvements could be achieved. As I said at the beginning, not on the assumption that we need to roll this back to a sort of Weberian bureaucracy where it's all done from head office. Far from it. We need to roll in the other direction. We need to actually take advantage of the fact that having multiple agencies, if their heart's in the right place, having them involved, using their initiative, working hard to find new solutions to hard problems, that seems to me to be a no-brainer. The NDIS might be on that path. The book argues that we're still early days to know. It is a bit scary to think that there's over 20,000 contractors in the NDIS system, and that number's expanding all the time. But on the other hand, they've done something that none of the other services have done well as yet, and that is create a more overt middle layer to help aggregate client interests. And the LACs, the local area coordinators, and the service coordinator options are at least a step in the direction of saying vulnerable clients will need some mediation on their side if they're going to face 21,510 private providers all wanting to get a hold of their package. But more to see on the NDIS front, obviously, and we look forward to seeing how the current review plays out. I'm over my time, but I believe we've got, Emma, space for Q&A if that's what people want. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Anne Youngwood. I think that's terrific. There's nothing I disagree with. And having worked in government, not for profit, I only went into government when there was nowhere else to go. Tendered everything out, and what had been a full service,
Yes.
split into bits, widgets. So Kennett knew the price of everything, the value of nothing, and totally. Anyway, I won't go on to that. And I see similarities with the CCT and what's been happening, and neoliberalism has obviously had a huge impact on this. You haven't mentioned Price Waterhouse scenario, and I think it's been just, my father-in-law was, well, I only found this out after I met him. I didn't know he was knighted, but Sir John Jungworth, who was head of the Premier's Department for 13 successive Premiers, finishing with Henry Bolte. And public service, has a place, it should be neutral, it should be done with great professionalism. And I think the tendering out that is done and the cutbacks in public service is appalling and going to more and more money snowballing to private providers in the Big Four. Well, I don't think it'll be the Big Four for much longer. But would you care to comment?
I don't really cover the consultants in the book. I'll offer you an opinion if that's of interest. But backing up a little bit from there, and I think the interesting thing for me is as this process of the embrace of a certain model of the social market took off as the de rigueur answer to so many challenges. As I mentioned in the talk, one of the headline issues was, including from senior public servants, saying, "Well, you don't want government telling you what to do, so we'll hand it over." Now, the flip side of that was a real change of climate, particularly in Canberra, much more than at the state level. The services that have done better are the ones where the Commonwealth has had to share its authority with the states, frankly, because it's been harder to sort of simply steamroll through and say, well, it's my way or the highway. But the other thing that's very evident, and I think the current government are already facing this, is that the ruling mentality in Canberra very quickly became, we don't do things. Right? We design things. Other people do the doing. Now, as many people in this room with much greater experience of the service delivery sector than I have would attest, you can't rule complex services from a distance without missing all sorts of important elements. And you can't rely on private consultants to go in and help you learn the detail of that. In places like health, where obviously there has been a lot of privatisation, we've still been able to maintain very rigorous transparency and argument about what the service delivery story should look like. We've had some missteps in that, but there's no assumption in the health department, none that I've ever interviewed, to say we're not interested in the detail. Yes, we are. We want to know how this got delivered all the way down to the bedpan. So that's the challenge from the public service side, that we now have a sort of ethos that says it's okay to be out of the service chain. In fact, it's a good thing. And then we rely on consultants and the private provider competition model will generate certain sorts of insights and so forth. That is a failed model, and that needs to change on both sides of the ledger. One of the arguments we've been putting forward in the employment services case is we don't want the CES back. Right? This is not nostalgia for some day when things were great. CES was not perfect. it needs to be nuanced around the idea that government should still have a place in that service delivery chain. Now, it might vary from different service as to what that is, but it's been very interesting to watch the horror of the aged care story, and to realise that in the evaluations of aged care service quality, the publicly provided aged care services, particularly in Victoria, have remained at the top of virtually every list. And understanding how publicly delivered services, in part, not necessarily across the board, can help pioneer and scene set and standard set, and are in a better position perhaps to share the insights of what they discover more broadly. Figuring out what the right public service or public provision element is, it'll differ from service to service, but holding the public service inside the service model first of all, not outside, and then figuring out what their place in the service chain should look like, seems to me to be good for both parts of this problem.
Could I just indulge in 30 seconds? Well, I have to leave early, so I'm on the board of Merry Community Health, or Merry Health as it's called.
Mm-hmm.
And Matt has got the sole contract now for the Carers Gateway in Victoria. When the Commonwealth tendered it out, it went to 9 providers, 9 brokers in Victoria, and then when they last tendered it, Mary's got the sole one. It's worth about $33 million. And they're very happy. They have communicated how happy they are. So I think it's just a really interesting balance where community health that developed it after Gough Whitlam's time, and Mary Health goes back with Coburg Community Health, Brunswick, all of those.
Yep.
And I think it's just brilliant because the person that's overseeing those services is supporting other services that are struggling to get up to speed and succeeding in doing that. So, I think that's a good news story, which we don't often get. So you're right about the Commonwealth, that they are being stringent on some of those things. So,
Indeed.
Yeah,
Indeed.
So I feel positive about that, and thank you. And who do I pay for the book?
Could you share some of your findings around the issues of equity? I mean, I'm assuming that you have a good bit to say about the issue of equity, which of course is fundamental to all of the things you're talking about.
Thank you. Yes, the common pattern in the so-called service market model is that those who succeed or who are seen to survive in a reasonably robust form, say in vet, are those who already have access to information and support to make the decisions that they need to make about their course or their provider or so on. And as soon as you move away from that high level of information and support for what is generally the minority of the people using these services, as soon as you move away from that, you downscale into a series of sort of traps for those who either don't have access to information or don't have anybody who can access information for them and with them, and who are thirdly not in a position to choose otherwise. So in the case of the so-called markets will evolve to suit demand, as we know in areas like aged care and childcare, it's not the case that there are multiple choices out there for people to make. There are still some parts of the service area where there's either no provider or only one. And the consequence of that for those who have to rely on that service is that not only don't they have any choice, but the degree of transparency and pressure on the quality of that service is close to zero. Now, you may be lucky and that might be a good service provider and they may do it well out of the goodness of their heart, but the chances are across the board that won't happen. The second part of the answer is that this whole story about choice and exit, it's been applied to other parts of the public policy realm, as you know. If you if you've put up with all those ads for meerkats, you'll know that it's a big deal in insurance, in health insurance, in car insurance, in all sorts of service areas. And both here and overseas, the evidence is overwhelming and unrebutted, which is that people don't shift. This idea of the educated consumer, be they middle class, a PhD or whatever, that people are not spending their spare time with or without meerkats trying to find the next $100 saving or better deal in these service areas. Choice magazine told me that they ran an attempt a few years ago to try and get out of just comparing washing machines to compare services. And they tried health insurance. I thought, well, we'll invite people to show us their health insurance cover, and then we'll go looking for a better deal. And they rang people up and they said, okay, I'll send it to you, which they did, sometimes reluctantly. And then they went back and said, you could make $1,000 if you shifted, and everything else is a tick, same cover, same cover, same cover. They got about 3% of people willing to do it. And then when they phoned them up later, they hadn't gone through and done it. The Dutch had the same experience. This model consumer behaviour that's meant to be the engine behind this is, for whatever reason, we could speculate, but is not a valid, reliable engine to drive anything. And if you add to that the disequity issues of not having information, not having somebody to talk to who's done it before, not having somebody who can support you through the risk side of this, then the effect on poorer people is just disastrous, in my view.
Mark.
Jamie.
Thank you for your book. It's an exceptional, really
Thank you.
remarkable book, and I learned so much from it. Can we talk a bit more about the neoliberalism subject that was raised before? It's often said, it's almost a cliche today, that neoliberalism is dead. But if there's nothing to replace it, neoliberalism is not dead. And so I wonder what you see in a sort of broad sense as, can you talk a bit about the role of government that your work has led you to? How you see government sort of playing a renewed role in the sectors that you've talked about, but also perhaps even more broadly. I mean, there were times reading your book when I actually thought things are so bad in these sectors, the government taking it over fully doesn't look that bad to me. and a bureaucrat once said to me, the government might be incompetent, but at least it's broadly ethical. And there's a lot of incompetence in the private sector, and often you don't have the ethical element. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts about renewal of government and how it might happen.
Thanks, Jamie. Thank you very much. I managed to get all the way through the book without saying neoliberalism once. And that was deliberate in the end, because I think it's a trap, right? And I think it's a trap because it doesn't really make us understand how governments on the left of centre got themselves into this mess, right? And that's part of the reason I put the Keating quote right up the front of the book. Everybody's had a hand in this, right? And it may be that they went to that for different reasons. I think it's true that they did. But it means on the way out we have to recognise that those different political traditions need to think about their own trajectory. So on the Labor side, a big part of this, I think, was the justifiable but overplayed hand around improving public sector management, and a big investment was made by the late John Cain, that era of Labor governments, and then by the Hawke Keating governments to significantly modernise and improve public management and microeconomic reform inside the public sector. All of that. But I don't think when you talk to many of the ex-ministers from that era that they ever thought they were buying this. Right? So there's a bit of recovery to do, I think, on the Labor side or on the left of centre side to say, well, as you frame it, Jamie, what did we want the public sector to become? Not just the public service, because that's a specific puzzle, but what did we want the public sector more broadly to look like? And I think there are ways in which a more active public sector presence in these services could be a catalyst for a significant service improvement without us having to contemplate the, I think, challenging and probably dangerous idea that they ought to all be nationalised. We don't have the staff to run such an enterprise, and I don't think there's political support to do it. And frankly, I doubt that it would be a solution. But let's think about what that catalytic role of the public sector is. And it'll be a bit different in the different cases. Now, I didn't get a chance to mention my obsession with real estate in all of this, but one of the big gaps that's opened up is on the capital side. So in areas like aged care, one of the deficits for a local community deciding it wants to provide a service, or an NGO wanting to expand a service for its future customers, is it's very expensive to find, buy and develop facilities that would make that happen effectively. And on the other side of that coin, once that asset has been privatised, it's much harder for government to contemplate, as it's had to recently, the idea that some of those services might just exit. Say, well, you put our fees up or our costs up one more time, and there's 12 services that will be shedding their clients. So there's some work to do on the public-private partnership side for the capital side of some of these services. And I think that's where the creative challenge is. Figuring out service by service what combination of the creation of a transparent service model, incentivising groups, including for-profit ones, if they want to play, to do that, openly and to share the results of what they do, and service standards that we think we could live by. And I think that would be probably quite different in vet than, for example, in employment services, where, as we know, there are compulsions on people and they're dependent on benefits. So it'd have to be, there'd be horses for courses, but reimagining the public sector story, I think, is separate from fixing the public service.
My name's Anthony. I do work in the cooperative movement, and I'm interested in your observations around people not shifting and voting with their feet. I'm wondering if you have any comments on actual voting, so in terms of consumer and employee ownership in the social sector. There are some developments happening in that area. So you also mentioned that going back to the nationalisation sort of model is probably not the way to go. So I guess I'm interested in your thoughts around mutualisation,
Yep.
And community ownership, worker ownership, and consumer ownership, particularly in these sort of service markets and individual sort of packages and those sorts of things.
Yep. Great question. I'm sure I'm not going to do justice to it. There is a part of the book where I look at what evolved in the Hawke Keating era around, first of all, contestability of services that were being funded by the Commonwealth, and then a shift from funding of the service to funding of effectively a voucher for the consumer. And this was I won't say it wasn't debated at the time, but it wasn't seen as a big cataclysmic one-way street, as it turned out to be. So in the previous contestable kind of phase, if we take childcare, the Commonwealth would directly fund local childcare centres with a combination of a grant for the establishment, sometimes in combination with local government, and then an annual contribution based on the qualifications of the staff that had to be employed. And then there would be co-payments where parents would, depending on their means, would contribute. Now, if you sort of step back from that community service model, what it expresses is, first of all, from the Commonwealth's point of view, a recognition that the service is a whole service. It's not just a payment to an individual to go find the service. So there's a recognition that we need to generate the wherewithal for that service to exist, whether it's on the capital side or whether it's on the recurrent annual budget side. That needs to be part of the mix. Now, there are various reasons why they moved to vouchers, but the consequence of moving to vouchers was to become quite stupidly agnostic about how the service facility development phase was then going to occur. Somehow the magic of the market was going to generate entrepreneurs who would find land, build services, put them in the right place, face them the right way, etc. But what was also lost in that movement was the cooperative element, the parents sitting on committees, the governance of those services, which came to be pilloried by consultants as services that had been taken over but by vested interests. Well, when the users are a vested interest, in a way that should be no bad thing for a service, right? But it got hammered time and again, particularly in the childcare area. So that's no good. You know, we can't have services that are being run by parents. So that's not an answer to your question, but it's a sort of thread that I think is important in some services to rethink why it was that we got out of the process at the public level of helping create the infrastructure and put it in the right place. I was in Copenhagen last year talking to them about the various ways in which their municipal services are organised. Copenhagen is a place where they do actually have a childcare service that's co-located with an aged care. The thing on the ABC, which is a story, is based on something that really happens, and obviously it's a magic solution to a lot of problems. So their difference, and they don't spend horrendously larger amounts of money on these services than we do. That's a myth that people like to put around about the Scandinavians. But what they do is require that the in this case the municipality is empowered to look at the whole service and to think about what are we going to need 20 years from now, and where's going to be the land put aside to do that, or should we share it with the sporting club or something else? Instead of which, we've now got entrepreneurs in the childcare game going out to factory sites, basically, or on busy streets. Australia apparently has the greatest number of dangerous sites for childcare centres anywhere in the OECD, because that's where the real estate is, and that's where local people won't necessarily complain that a private provider is trying to buy a house in their street and turn it into a childcare centre. So we've created in some ways quite a toxic environment for some of these services. So cooperatives, yes, I would put that under the heading of where's the transparency and the involvement of communities in the governance of these things, but also in the commitment to helping defend them and build them. And I think that in both childcare and aged care, there are great examples in other countries where that works well.
So basically he's arguing that we rely on the notion of exit to give an idea of what users think about something, and the problem is it doesn't tell you anything, it just tells you that they've left. And that voice is a much stronger way of people who use services giving information about what works, what doesn't work. Just to note, his backstory is told in Transatlantic, which is on Netflix. So he was a German Jew, got out of Germany via Vichy, France, and was quite brave. So if you look at something like the NDIS, so you've got something that in some respects came out of consumer voice. It said, what you're giving us is not what we need. But in the service system that's been created out of that notion of voice in design seems to have been lost. So I guess my question builds on that last one a bit, but my question to you is if we're retaining these kind of market-related service systems, where's the play and place of voice?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. It's more or less the last chapter of the book. But it's a very inconclusive last chapter because I think we're all thinking about this and trying to figure it out. And the talk about governance of things like local childcare is just one small Lego block in that bigger story. I quote a case in a study in the book. A psychologist who was trying to understand this whole choice issue and why it wasn't really working. Choice is the exit bit, right? I know it's used as choice and control in social services as though it was basically a pseudonym for empowerment, but it is essentially an economic view, as Hirschman argues. And in this study, they asked a proper random sample of Americans the following horrendous question. If you got cancer, would you like to choose your own services and therapies? And a very significant majority of people, I think it was up in the 60%, said yes, absolutely. And then they asked the same question to people who actually had cancer. And of course, the number plummets to something like 12%. What the 12% want is voice. What they express is the desire to be inside the conversation about what we're going to do and what the options are and why this one could be better than that one, etc. Not to be turned loose into the sort of choose your own nightmare of having to decide, well, will I go with chemo this week, or will I do weeds and seeds for a few months, or whatever nightmare that a kind of consumer choice idea puts forward. And the reality that sits underneath this for me is that services don't exist until they're being consumed. You can't make a service, put it in the warehouse, and then dial it up on eBay and have it delivered when you need it. So services are only and always what gets enacted when they're experienced. So for me, the voice story is actually about where you put empowerment of clients, but also their nearest and best supporters to be in the conversation when the service is being delivered. Not when you're choosing the old folks' home that all say that they have home-cooked meals. When you're there a month later and the home-cooked meal is one cold sausage and some dead potatoes, you need to have access to people who will hear your voice on that topic and do something with it. So each of these services would seem to me to have both a human rights argument about voice, but also a service delivery effectiveness argument about voice. And I think it's getting those two together that would actually lift all boats.
Right, we are going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Mark. We have 7 copies of the book left, so you'll have to fight amongst yourselves. But it is available at all good bookstores and through Melbourne University Press. I suspect if you want a copy from Readings, you'll have to come south of the river because all the Northsiders will have bought theirs already. Online as well, that's right, thank you. I don't have a speaker to announce for you quite yet for next month, but stay tuned, it won't be long until I'm able to confirm that. And I'd just like to say a couple of things. Firstly, happy birthday to our friend James Button. Secondly, thank you so much, Mark, for joining us today. We've wanted to get you along to talk about this for a long time, so I'm pleased we made it happen. And thirdly, in the papers tomorrow, you will see the first report written by Lucy Tonkin, who is our Andrew Harrington Fellow at Per Capita. And Lucy's taken a really deep dive with Matt Lloyd-Cape at the Centre for Equitable Housing and Marg McKenzie as well into the gendered nature of the housing crisis. And there's some pretty disturbing stuff in there, which none of the women in this room will be surprised to hear, I'm sure. But just congratulations to Lucy on a fantastic piece of work that's going to be covered in The Age tomorrow. So we will see you all, I hope, next month, and we will hopefully be announcing soon, I was asked today, the speaker for the John Cain oration. It's a little bit late this year. It's a busy time for everyone, but we're hoping to have that to announce to you soon as well. Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.